Okay, good afternoon, Happy New Year, and welcome back. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Tom Dannenbaum. I joined the Stanford faculty this summer, joined at the law school and here at CSAC. And it's my great pleasure today to welcome and introduce my friend and colleague, Kevin John Heller, Professor of International Law and Security at the Copenhagen University Center for Military Studies. I had the privilege of introducing Kevin yesterday in my other capacity over at the law school. And even though the audience is almost entirely different, as a matter of personal principle, I feel I can't simply say the same thing twice. So rather than the traditional introduction, which would involve an enumeration of Kevin's many impressive contributions to international law scholarship and practice, I want to instead focus on a couple of things about Kevin that I think make him unique in the International Legal Academy. In particular, his breadth and his humanity. Although after his talk, referencing his humanity as something that's commendable might no longer seem as compelling as it does ex ante. His breadth manifests across multiple dimensions. Kevin is, I think, the only international law scholar of his repute to have held permanent positions across at least 6 countries and 4 continents. He has led Opinio Juris, the leading international law blog, as the editor-in-chief, into an era in which it has undeniably the broadest diversity of authors and editors contributing on issues of international law, and in a context in which we know that international law is perceived, understood, and encountered very differently from different parts of the world. That is both in his personal scholarship and in his leadership of that discourse on that blog, a really important contribution to the International Legal Academy. But his breadth isn't just geographic, it's also temporal. Kevin has written the canonical text on the Nuremberg military tribunals. Those are the subsequent tribunals after the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg that provided many of the key precedents upon which the international criminal tribunals that were developed in the 1990s relied. And the go-to text for understanding those tribunals, understanding what was done in those tribunals and the cases, is Kevin's book on the subject. And he's also writing right now on international law in the context of the Vietnam War, in particular in relation to environmental issues. And he's got a book coming out this year on that. So he's very much immersed in and expert in the history of international law. But he's also very much in the present of international law, both in his practice, currently, for example, as the Special Advisor on War Crimes at the International Criminal Court Office of the Prosecutor, but also in his prolific blogging for Opinio Juris, where he regularly comments on the issues of the day in international law in real time, and probably more than any other international law scholar in the world. And of course, as we're going to hear today, he's thinking about the future of international law and how international law is going to adapt to new technologies and developments. So he's equally comfortable in the history, the present, and the future of this particular area. And finally, methodologically, he's broad in terms of his ability to draw on the methods of history, the methods of critical theory, and operate as a positivist international lawyer. But the thing that I think, for me at least, is the most important thing about Kevin is his humanity. Kevin, for international lawyers, will have been familiar on the page before he's familiar in person. It's impossible, if you work in this area, to have met Kevin before you've read him. And if you read him, the characteristic traits are he's direct, he's precise, and he's devastating with respect to the counter-arguments with which he's engaging. And so you might think this is going to be somebody who's hard-edged, sharp-elbowed, and pugnacious in person. And certainly that was the impression I had before meeting him. But he's one of the kindest and most generous scholars I know. He opens doors, he lifts people up, and particularly lifts people up who otherwise don't have access to the hallowed halls of the most prestigious universities in the world. And so he's, for me, my favorite person with whom to disagree, and we may end up disagreeing today, because I know that in the course of that disagreement, I will get the most robust and powerful argument against the position I'm taking, but that it will be delivered with kindness and generosity. So I'm really delighted to welcome Kevin today, and I should end actually by saying, more importantly than anything else, he's a proud Stanford alumnus, having got his JD here in 1996, 30 years ago, So we're delighted to welcome you back and to hear from you today on the concept of the human and the critique of autonomous weapons.
Thank you, Tom. I mean, I've given probably 200 lectures in my career, and I think that honestly is the nicest of all the introductions that I've had. So maybe we should just rest on that. Like, just, it's all downhill if I actually start speaking.
It only happens if you get 2 introductions. Yesterday's was much more.
But it is kind of funny because I think the most common response to people who meet me for the first time is, wow, you're a lot nicer in person than I thought you were going to be, which is my fault because it's just the way that I tend to write, particularly when I blog. But first off, thank you all for coming. A double thank you to those of you who are masochistic enough to come to my talk yesterday and my talk today. All I can really say is they are extremely different talks. This is the one that I tend to get excommunicated from my lefty circles from. This is, you'll see, this is a very different take on autonomous weapons that most progressive or left-wing legal scholars would tend to take. So I look forward to your questions afterward, and I shouldn't speak for more than probably 35 minutes, so we'll have a lot of time for discussion. So to launch in the last few years alone, killer robots, what of course are less tendentiously described as autonomous weapons, have been used for offensive purposes in Libya, in Syria, in Nagorno-Karabakh, and of course, probably most intensely by both sides of the conflict in Ukraine. And I also think it's safe to say that it's only a matter of time before autonomous weapons really do become ubiquitous on the modern battlefield, because the military advantages they provide, such as increased force protection, enhanced targeting precision, these things have led to an increasingly frantic arms race by, in particular, the United States, Russia, and China. To quote the noted political theorist Vladimir Putin, quote, "Whoever becomes the leader in AI will become the ruler of the world." Now, at the same time, of course, the urgency with which powerful states are developing autonomous weapons has been met by an equally urgent campaign to prohibit them. The campaign to stop killer robots was founded in 2013 and is currently supported by more than 180 civil society organizations around the world, including some of the most important human rights groups, such as Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International. So I want to begin my presentation today by showing you a quote from the Campaign to Stop Killer Robots website. This quote really captures the essence of the campaign's opposition to autonomous weapons. And notice how often the campaign invokes the concept of humanity. And that's not remotely idiosyncratic. On the contrary, the idea that killer robots are problematic precisely because they are not human is really at the core of almost every critique of autonomous weapons that you will come across. And so in the time that I have today, I want to challenge that human-centered critique really by making 3 interrelated arguments. First, I will argue that the critique assumes a very specific and, more importantly, deeply flawed concept of the human, namely someone who perceives the world accurately, understands rationally, quarantines negative emotions, and reliably translates thought into action. Second, I will argue that once we recognize the situatedness and the failings of ordinary humans, particularly ordinary humans who are exposed to the danger, stress, and uncertainty of combat, we have to acknowledge that it is possible, even likely, that killer robots will eventually be able to comply with international humanitarian law better than human soldiers in at least many, if not most, combat situations. And then third, and finally, I will argue that acknowledging the coming practical superiority of killer robots over human soldiers creates a problem that can only generously be described as wicked. On the one hand, the development and use of autonomous weapons will make war more humane. But on the other hand, the increased humanity of war brought about by autonomous weapons will make war itself more difficult to eradicate. So we'll unpack those arguments in what follows. So in the article that this talk is based on, which was recently published in the Harvard National Security Journal, I critique a number of scholars who make the deontological claim that it would be unethical to use autonomous weapons in combat, even if they could outperform human soldiers. I'm not going to deal with the deontological arguments today. The most common argument against autonomous weapons is explicitly consequentialist, namely that such weapons will never be able to comply with IHL as well as human soldiers because IHL compliance itself requires the kind of judgment and emotional awareness that only humans possess. I think it is highly likely that this consequentialist argument underestimates the technological potential of autonomous weapons. But this lecture is not about technology. Instead, I want to focus on what I think is the more fundamental problem with the consequentialist argument, which is that it vastly overstates the ability of human soldiers to comply with IHL. Simply put, the consequentialist argument valorizes a particular concept of the human that is belied by literally decades of research in cognitive psychology. It is precisely humans as they actually are, not as critics of killer robots assume them to be, that explains why combat using machines may eventually be more humane than combat with human soldiers. So, at the outset, we need to be clear about what kind of cognition is required to comply with IHL. Consider the principle of distinction, which categorically prohibits intentionally attacking civilians and civilian objects. Scholars often claim that autonomous weapons will never be able to comply with the principle of distinction because determining whether an individual is targetable requires the ability to assess her subjective mental state, something that humans can do, but autonomous weapons obviously cannot. Now, I agree with the technological pessimism, but the claim that the principle of distinction requires an attacker to determine a target's mental state is significantly overstated. In fact, targetability is almost always determined on the basis of objective, externally manifested signs and behavior, rendering what is going on in the mind of the target irrelevant. That's a critical point, because there's no reason to believe that human soldiers will always be better at recognizing those signs and behaviors than autonomous weapons. And if killer robots ever do become better at object recognition than human soldiers, which I think is likely, much of the distinction obligation will collapse. Now, the irrelevance of subjective mental states to the principle of distinction is most obvious in the context of recognizing combatants. Combatants, whether we're talking about members of a state's armed forces or members of an organized armed group. Determining whether an individual is a combatant requires only the ability to recognize that she is wearing a uniform or a fixed and distinctive sign. If she is, her mental state is irrelevant. IHL permits her to be attacked anytime, anywhere, with any amount of force. To be sure, there are situations in which the principle of distinction is more difficult to apply. One situation that is very commonly mentioned by critics of autonomous weapons is where a combatant is surrendering. In their view, identifying surrender requires the ability to determine whether a combatant intends to surrender. Again, something autonomous weapons obviously cannot do. Once again, though, critics like Sparrow confuse the subjective and the objective. It is true that a combatant must intend to surrender to qualify as hors de combat. Under IHL, however, that intent must be externally manifested through specific types of action. Note the wording of Article 41 of the first additional protocol. It does not protect a combatant who intends to surrender. It protects a combatant who clearly expresses an intention to surrender. And that is a very fundamental difference. If a combatant does not externally manifest his intention to surrender in a manner consistent with the ICRC's commentary on Article 41, he remains a lawful target. He's a lawful target even if, in his heart of hearts, he genuinely wants to stop fighting. Similarly, if the combatant does manifest a clear intention to surrender, he cannot be targeted even if he actually intends to start shooting, and the minute that his enemy comes to capture him, an act of perfidy. It is only when he begins to externally manifest his perfidiousness that he can be lawfully targeted again. Now, there is still an even more difficult distinction situation worth considering: direct participation in hostilities. When a civilian directly participates in hostilities, he loses his protection against attack for the duration of his direct participation. Now, critics often claim that killer robots will never be able to distinguish between civilians and civilians who directly participate in hostilities, again, because that distinction, in their view, requires assessing the civilian's intent. Human Rights Watch, for example, focuses on a hypothetical scenario in which a frightened mother runs after her two children to stop them from playing with toy guns too close to a soldier. In Human Rights Watch's view, autonomous weapons will always be far more likely than a human soldier to mistakenly attack the children. And this is indeed a very difficult scenario. So let's unpack it a little bit. Unfortunately, as I imagine you all know, children do become lawful targets if they directly participate in hostilities. So the key issue in this scenario is whether the soldier recognizes that the children are actually holding toy guns. If he does recognize that, the children are not DPHing, and they're absolutely protected against attack. It doesn't matter whether they subjectively hate the soldier. It doesn't matter whether they're deliberately pointing the toy guns at the soldier instead of playing with each other. They cannot be lawfully attacked. So, in this scenario, would a killer robot be more likely than a human to mistakenly conclude that the toy guns are real? Now, in terms of object recognition, there's no reason to believe that that would be the case. An advanced autonomous weapon could be programmed to distinguish a gun from a stick and to recognize a wide variety of toy guns. But what if the toy guns were indistinguishable from real ones? Would a human be more likely to correctly infer from the mother's fear and the children's actions that the guns were in fact toys, despite looking so real? Now here, I think that's probably the case. There is no reason why an autonomous weapon could not recognize a look of fear as well as a human. But a human may well be better able to understand the meaning of the mother's fear. That it's more likely motivated by the possibility of a terrible misunderstanding than by not wanting harm to come to two young insurgents. And I also think there's no question that a human would be more likely to recognize the child's actions, despite their seemingly real guns, as play instead of as an attack. I'm not claiming then that human judgment is irrelevant on the battlefield. In principle, there will be situations where a human soldier's understanding of the nuances of human emotion, nuances of human behavior, may well make him less likely than a machine to violate the principle of distinction. The key to this admission, however, is the qualifier in principle. The analysis so far assumes that despite initially believing that the toy guns are real, the human soldier is nevertheless able to reach the correct interpretation of the situation, accurately perceiving the mother to be frightened, accurately understanding that the children are playing, correctly inferring from those two circumstantial facts that the guns are in fact toys, and also lowering his own weapon before opening fire. In perfect circumstances, a human soldier may well be able to do all of those things. But again, as everybody in this room knows, there are no perfect circumstances in combat. So let's make this scenario more realistic. Let's assume that the soldier is relatively green, hasn't slept for 36 hours, is terrified of being killed, and recently saw a close friend die at the hands of the enemy. Let's assume he comes across the children while close-up combat is raging around him. And let's assume that the children are 15, still children, but more than old enough to pose him a real threat. This is a very different situation, to put it mildly. Indeed, cognitive psychology tells us that the human soldier is now very likely to make a serious mistake concerning perception, judgment, or action, or in fact, all three. Perhaps the human soldier misperceives the mother's emotion as anger instead of fear. Perhaps he mistakes the toy guns being pointed at him as a hostile act instead of as happy play. Or perhaps he pulls the trigger reflexively instead of consciously releasing it. If the human soldier makes any of those mistakes, the children are dead and the principle of distinction has been violated. My point is this. When critics argue that killer robots will never be able to comply with IHL as well as human soldiers because they lack human judgment, they're assuming a very specific conception of the human. Again, someone who perceives the world accurately, exercises rational judgment, is unaffected by negative emotions, and reliably translates thought into action. If that human existed, there is no question human soldiers would normally be preferable to autonomous weapons. But therein lies the rub. That human doesn't exist. On the contrary, if we have learned anything from cognitive psychology over the past few decades, it is that humans do not make decisions rationally, dispassionately, and objectively. Instead, their decision-making is profoundly distorted by cognitive biases and negative emotions. And that is nowhere, literally nowhere, more true than in combat, where life and death decisions must be made exceptionally quickly in situations marked by danger and uncertainty. Now, I could pause here and discuss some of the notorious massacres carried out by human soldiers, Katyn, My Lai, Halabja, Sinjar, Bucha, but instead let me give you some statistics about fratricide. During Operation Desert Storm in Iraq, friendly fire accounted for 24% of all American casualties and 77% of all destroyed American armored vehicles. According to researchers, 80 to 85% of those accidents were caused by errors of human cognition. That's a staggering percentage, and one I think that should give us pause before we reflexively insist that human soldiers are and will be, merely by virtue of their humanity, inherently superior to robotic ones. Now, I don't have time to give you an in-depth look at how cognitive biases and negative emotions distort the decision-making of human soldiers. Let me simply mention two biases and one emotion. The first bias is cognitive overload. Studies have found that soldiers must focus nearly all of their attention on an unknown individual to accurately identify whether she is a combatant or a civilian. In combat, however, soldiers are almost always required to multitask. Infantry, for example, must simultaneously identify targets, operate their weapons, and listen to their commander's instructions. That multitasking significantly reduces the accuracy of target identification because it overloads soldiers' attitudinal capacity or attentional capacity. And that cognitive overload becomes even worse in normal combat situations, such as the ones I added to our hypothetical scenario: heat, noise, time pressure, exhaustion. Exhaustion, for example, has been found to significantly degrade general cognitive performance, situational awareness, and reaction time. Now, a second cognitive limitation, this one you'll all be aware of, if you're not aware of the first one, is confirmation bias. The tendency of humans to give greater weight to evidence that confirms their pre-existing beliefs than evidence that calls those beliefs into question. To take only one example, studies indicate that confirmation bias is a leading cause of vehicle misidentification in combat. Soldiers expect the vehicles they encounter on a battlefield to belong to the enemy. When they come across an actual vehicle, that expectation often leads them to notice aspects of the vehicle that are consistent with it being a military objective and ignore aspects of the vehicle that do not. And then, of course, that in turn makes them more likely to mistake a civilian vehicle for a military one. Negative emotions. They also profoundly distort perception, judgment, and action. Studies have found, for example, that the stress of combat not only leads to perceptual tunneling, reduced working memory, and performance rigidity, it also makes soldiers prone to what is known as, quote, ballistic decision-making, making decisions without considering the consequences. Other researchers have identified what they call, quote, acute combat stress-induced cognitive decline, cognitive impairment that exceeds the cognitive impairment caused by intoxication or even the use of sedatives. Indeed, a different study found that soldiers in a state of high anxiety failed to recognize an individual's attempt to surrender 1 in every 5 times, a 20% error rate, largely due to the stress of combat. Now, these considerations are literally just the tip of the iceberg. I've mentioned 3 cognitive biases, or actually 2 cognitive biases and 1 negative emotion, and there are at least 90 more. The point is that when we compare killer robots to human soldiers in terms of their current and future ability to comply with IHL, we can't just focus on the technological capabilities of autonomous weapons. We also need to take into account the cognitive limits of human soldiers. That changes the calculus significantly, for the simple reason that machines are not subject to cognitive biases or negative emotions. Machines do not suffer cognitive overload because of multitasking, heat, or noise. Machines do not experience confirmation bias or object use bias, and machines do not get tired or feel stress. Now, to be sure, machines also don't feel empathy or mercy or compassion. And that absence underlies another very common critique of killer robots, which is that soldiers cannot be machines because positive emotions are necessary to ensure that combat remains as humane as possible. Now, sometimes this argument is legal in nature, as the quote from Peter Asaro indicates. That, I think it is safe to say, is clearly wrong. IHL requires soldiers to comply with the rules governing the conduct of hostilities and nothing more. They may well choose not to kill, even when they are entitled to do so, but that's an ethical decision, not a legal one. So more often, the argument is explicitly ethical, that even if soldiers have the right to kill, it is important to ensure that the emotions that lead them not to kill remain present on the battlefield. Now, I think there are a number of problems with this positive emotions argument. To begin with, as a critique of autonomous weapons, it's anachronistic. The quotes from Asaro and from Haynes assume face-to-face combat, where a soldier can look into the eyes of the enemy soldier she is about to kill. Most modern warfare, however, is remote. Empathy, mercy, and compassion are irrelevant to the bombardier releasing a payload from 35,000 feet. And they are scarcely more relevant to the drone pilot manipulating a joystick thousands of miles away from the battlefield. But it's also important not to be seduced by rosy images of compassionate soldiers choosing not to kill the enemy, despite being legally entitled to do so. Consider a situation that occurred at Anzio during World War II, a situation that Michael Walzer cites in his famous Just and Unjust Wars in defense of not killing what he calls the naked soldier. Now, the British soldier speaking in the first person said that they should just scare the harmless German soldier away with a warning shot. And all of his colleagues, his comrades, laughed in agreement. Ethical, right? The German soldier wasn't posing them a threat. He was enjoying a beautiful summer day. Isn't, of course, the right thing to do to not shoot him while he's looking at the beautiful flower. Well, here's what the soldier said next. Personally, you don't have to agree, of course, I'm with Sergeant Chesterin. The reason why IHL permits targeting combatants anytime, anywhere, with any amount of force is because they have both the right and the ability to shoot back. A soldier might feel kinship with an enemy soldier who is wandering through a lovely field, but that enemy soldier has been trained to kill. And if he's left alive now, that is precisely what he is likely to do later. So the mercy shown toward the enemy soldier now may come at an incalculable cost later. So the rational subject, in short, is indeed critical to humane warfare. The problem, I think, for the critics of autonomous weapons is that machines approximate that subject far more closely than humans do themselves. And it should not be a surprise that it's likely that autonomous weapons will eventually make better combatants than humans. Humans do not naturally kill. They don't naturally kill even when their cause is just and even when their own lives depend on it. In World War II, for example, survey research found that only 2 out of every 10 American infantrymen fired their weapons at the enemy, even when they were under direct attack. I was shocked when I came across that statistic. Militaries, however, have long known this. This is why they have devoted so much effort to learning how to train soldiers to kill. There's even a name for this science, killology. And killology works. By the time of the Korean War, 6 out of 10 American infantrymen would fire their weapon at the enemy. And by the Vietnam War, that ratio had increased to 9 out of 10. So this kind of well-trained soldier, you'll all know this, is often described as a killing machine, or to quote Human Rights Watch, as having a, quote, robot psychology. These kinds of mechanical metaphors, however, are both unfair and inapt. They're unfair because machines follow rules in a way that even the best trained humans do not. And the metaphors are inapt because no amount of training can ever completely rid humans of their cognitive biases and negative emotions. In fact, studies have shown that training soldiers to suppress their emotions, such as anger and hate, often has precisely the opposite effect. So, in short, if we want to produce ideal soldiers, soldiers whose use of force maximally complies with IHL, we should encourage the development of killer robots, not seek to ban them. Again, eventually, combat fought with machines will almost certainly be more humane than combat fought solely by actual humans. Now, again, you don't have to agree, but I think the evidence for this conclusion is compelling. So why are so many consequentialists opposed to autonomous weapons? My suspicion is that, in fact, most are not actually afraid that killer robots will be worse soldiers than humans. Their real concern is that killer robots will be better soldiers than humans. Now, this is most obvious with consequentialists who emphasize positive emotions like mercy and compassion. Autonomous weapons are problematic because for these consequentialists, because only human soldiers can choose not to kill when legally entitled to do so. A killer robot will use force whenever its programming demands it. In terms of minimizing violence, therefore, not even the quote perfect autonomous weapon is as good as a compassionate human soldier, because there will be no opportunity for mercy or compassion. That said, the fear that autonomous weapons will be better soldiers than humans, not worse, is even more evident in critics who emphasize an aspect of war that I have not yet discussed, the jus ad bellum. So as Noel Sharkey has noted, the threat of dead soldiers is an important deterrent for states contemplating going to war, particularly democratic ones, where public opinion more directly translates into political power. A state that can replace large numbers of human soldiers with autonomous weapons will find it easier to maintain public support for a war than a state that can only fight with human soldiers. That's the argument. Now, I think this argument does contain an important grain of truth, but it's not entirely adequate. Most importantly, the argument assumes that international law should try to deter war by requiring states to risk the lives of as many soldiers as possible. Now, that idea may seem attractive in the context of a war of aggression, where we feel little sympathy for the aggressor. But if deterrence fails, it will not be the aggressor's political and military leaders who will suffer from banning autonomous weapons. It will be the human soldiers that they wrongly send into battle. Moreover, a ban on autonomous weapons would affect any state that has to use military force, even when acting in self-defense. Should a state defending itself against aggression, like Ukraine, be required to risk the lives of its soldiers unnecessarily when it can use autonomous weapons in a manner that complies with IHL? And I think that we are seeing that more and more on the battlefield in Ukraine, where Ukraine has reaped the benefits of considerable force protection by using fully autonomous weapons in areas where if human soldiers had to be fighting, there would be catastrophic consequences. The ad bellum argument, however, also doesn't go far enough. Although publics will always care more about the lives of their own soldiers, there is considerable empirical evidence that public opinion is also sensitive to civilian casualties on the other side, a lesson the US learned the hard way during Vietnam, as Sharkey notes. Simply put, there are only so many My Lais that a democratic populace is willing to tolerate. So the strongest version of the ad bellum argument against killer robots would not focus simply on how reducing military casualties will make it easier for states to fight wars. It would also emphasize how autonomous weapons will have the same effect by producing fewer civilian casualties on the other side than wars fought solely by human soldiers. So, to conclude, we often speak of the inhumanity of war. That shibboleth, however, is kind of ironic. War is a uniquely human endeavor, and it is precisely the nature of humans that makes it so violent and destructive. So instead of arguing that war needs to be made less inhuman, perhaps we should argue that war needs to be made more robotic. As I've tried to show in this presentation, the development of killer robots does promise far more humane war than war fought by human soldiers. That does not mean, however, that killer robots are an unmitigated good. On the contrary, as I've also tried to emphasize, there is indeed a powerful jus ad bellum argument against them, because their development and use is likely to make the decision to go to war even easier for powerful states than it already is. So Sir Peter Schaeffer, the great English playwright, once described tragedy as, quote, not a conflict between right and wrong, but between two different kinds of right. That quote, I think, encapsulates the dilemma created by autonomous weapons. It is right to make war more humane, because unnecessary death and suffering and conflict should always be avoided whenever possible. But it is even more right to end war itself, because without war, there would be no death or suffering to minimize. Those two ideals, however, cannot necessarily be reconciled. The more humane war becomes, the more difficult it will be to eradicate it. That's the choice. It is a stark one, and it's one that only humans can make. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks very much to Kevin. I already see people popping up. I'm going to exploit the moderator's privilege to ask a question. But as a human being with profound psychological constraints and flaws, I'm not going to be able to keep track of the queue until I pose that question. So I'll return to all of those hands momentarily. But the first question I wanted to pose to you is, within the four corners of international humanitarian law, and thinking about the juxtaposition of human beings and machines with respect to IHL compliance in the same situation, I think it's plausible to argue that machines can do as well, and maybe in some circumstances or at some future level of development, better than human beings. So that part of the argument, I think, is ultimately compelling, precisely because of all of the flaws of human beings in that respect, both in terms of capability and propensity. With the ad bellum question, I think there are some more complicated debates to be held. But I think the biggest problem here is neither of those things. It's instead how this particular phenomenon will change the conditions under which we're asking the questions in the first place. So it's not that we have scenario X and can a human being perform better or a machine perform better under the requirements of international humanitarian law. It's does the fact of these kinds of systems mean that we're actually going to be looking at this in situations Y and Z? And does looking at it in situations Y and Z mean we're now looking at forms of domination and forms of the application of violence that become more ubiquitous and more pervasive than would be the case absent the development of these machines? So concretely, many of the arguments that you've made could also be made with respect to drones. They're clearly better at complying with international humanitarian law because you can hover for longer, you can surveil for longer, you can take greater precautions, you can wait until civilians have moved, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But what have they done? They've moved the battlefield beyond the line of contact into people's neighborhoods and into their homes, and with a permanence and a projection that means that entire populations are living under the constant fear of surveillance that's endowed with lethality. And it seems to me that autonomous weapon systems compound that massively and allow for an even more insidious invasion of the lethality of war into ordinary life beyond the line of contact. And that given the asymmetry of technological and financial capability, that this will allow for domination that might be framed through the lens of armed conflict and might therefore be evaluated through the standards of international humanitarian law, but is in fact something quite different and is an entirely different paradigm of the human application of violence through machines. And the problem with autonomous weapon systems is the aperture of that opens massively. And just to add one more layer to that, this is happening at the same time as a lot of the development of the technology is occurring in the private sector, owned by actors who are themselves concentrating wealth, some of whom have incredible ambitions, in a context in which maybe they are also, in certain circumstances, maybe not in the United States, given the power of the US military and so on, but in certain circumstances, going to be able to apply that kind of domination privately, which is maybe even more troubling than when it's applied through public authority. And so I know this is in a sense an unfair question because it's orthogonal to your channel of argument, which is really about whether these things can comply better with international humanitarian law. But isn't the problem not compliance with international humanitarian law, but how this changes the paradigm of how we use violence, such that we're asking the question of IHL compliance in scenarios in which we'd never previously asked it, and that creates modes of domination that are themselves deeply troubling. And now I'm attentive to the queue.
Oh, should I not respond?
No, you should respond. I just need to now focus on the million hands that just flew up. Okay.
Wow, that's a lot of hands.
I didn't even. Okay.
I can't answer the question while you're looking around and writing names down. There was an awful lot in Tom's question that I could spend probably the rest of our time together answering. Let me start with what he ended with. I think probably the best criticism of autonomous weapons is that capitalism really sucks. And here, the best I can do is really cite the work of my friend Elke Schwartz at King's College in the War Studies, who we disagree very much about the capabilities and potential of autonomous weapons. We are very, very much in agreement about the perverse incentives that are created by the fact that it is largely extremely powerful capitalist defense contractors that are developing this technology. And none of us should think that they have anyone's best interests in mind. So that whole aspect of the critique of autonomous weapons, I totally buy, and I do not have an adequate answer for. And I think it is an incredibly important aspect of this debate to keep in mind. And as you said, I'm doing something very different in this particular talk. You can't separate the issue of, well, will the technology actually be developed in a way that emphasizes IHL compliance as opposed to lethality? I mean, with what you started with, I mean, I don't think that your comment, you put it more eloquently than I did, as per usual. But I think you're making the point that I'm trying to make, that, you know, if we're expanding the battle space because of the force protection of autonomous weapons, if we believe that the autonomous weapons are complying with IHL as well as or better than human soldiers, that's not necessarily a problem. Yes, it's bad that we've got bigger battle space, but it's a more humane battle space. But the jus ad bellum question is, I think, a really, really important one. Because I do buy, and this, I know you don't like him, but Sam Moyn's book, Humane, I do think there is really something to this idea that when you lower the costs of using force, whether it's by protecting your own soldiers or minimizing the civilian casualties on the other side, it does make it easier for powerful states that have access to this technology to use that technology in spaces that they didn't use it before. When you had to look the person that you were trying to kill in the eye because you were fighting with swords, there was natural limits to the extent of the battle space. The more that war fighting has become remote, the easier it is to expand its geographic spread. And I think that's a real problem. What I would say, and I do a lot more of this in the article than I did in the talk, is part of my beef with the autonomous weapons critics is that some of their best arguments are not arguments about autonomous weapons. They're arguments about remote warfare. They're arguments against any kind of weapon that makes it safer for the person using the weapon and less likely to kill a civilian, whether it's a drone or, frankly, a sniper rifle. I mean, a sniper rifle has that same effect, perhaps not to the same degree, as an autonomous weapon. So my point being, I'll end with this, that so many of the arguments against autonomous weapons are really arguments against modern warfare. And I have no problem with that. I don't like war. I'd like war to go away. But if your objection to autonomous weapons and whatever resulting policy outcomes would follow from your objection means that militaries have to give up basically every weapon they've developed over the past century, I don't think that's an effective attack on autonomous weapons. I think if you're going to say there's something uniquely bad about autonomous weapons that we need to nip in the bud with a prohibition really before they even become particularly common, you have to find some criticism of them that doesn't apply to weapons that have been used largely without controversy for decades. I I turned your question into what I wanted to say, but that's what next to.
Let's see what everybody does. Yeah, go
ahead. Yeah, thank you so much. That was really interesting and thought-provoking. I was wondering, and I have a lot of questions, but I tried to limit myself on like one subset of questions around, because you criticize, the idea of the human a lot, but what do you have to say about, autonomous weapons, the technology, and how do you conceptualize that and what falls under it? And I think you talked about Ukraine and, autonomous drones, but what about Israel and AI decision support systems, which work very differently and follow a different logic and thereby might also have different repercussions from what you're talking about? And then I was also wondering, because what do you understand as, the machine being better than the human? Is it this focus on accuracy? And what does that mean, when we talk about this in terms of legal and ethical questions? If we only talk about this idea of autonomy as more accuracy, and does that leave open spaces for other problems that we might not see?
I mean, you managed to fold a lot into questions. I mean, at the end, with the last point, I mean, I am doing something very specific in at least this presentation, which is just focusing on IHL compliance. So, it's a relentlessly consequentialist argument where if in fact we could show in a particular type of combat, particular type of conflict, autonomous weapon can comply with IHL better, I don't see at least a consequentialist objection to using the weapon. With the first part of your question, I have a really wonderful friend, Jessica Dorsey, who teaches at Utrecht. And she said to me after I published this article, she's like, Kevin, when did you become so pro-machine? And I said, I'm not pro-machine, I'm anti-human. And I meant it kind of facetiously, but not so facetiously. I mean, I'm not a technology expert. I don't understand AI and autonomy as well as many people who write probably more wisely in this space than I do. But I do have a lot of background in cognitive psychology, and I've been writing about the cognitive psychology of law in particular for my entire career. I take seriously the comments of the people who do understand the technology and trying to forecast how good this technology will become over time. But I can't really add anything to that debate. What I've been trying to add is to say that it is not just about technological potential. It's also about human potential and human limits. This entire project came from, I can't even remember who I was having a discussion with, but basically someone who in every other circumstance other than autonomous weapons is incredibly skeptical of human soldiers. I mean, human soldiers are the ones who commit all of these atrocities. And if you talk to them in any other situation, it'll be an endless complaint about how bad soldiers are. But then when it's autonomous weapons, oh my God, we have to have human soldiers. We can't have technology because humans, they think and they infer and I was just struck by like, well, if you don't trust human soldiers in any other situations, why do you suddenly have a very different kind of soldier when you're talking about autonomous weapons? And that's when I started to kind of dig into this topic. And so in some ways, my goal is relatively modest. It's just to say, if you want to compare humans to autonomous weapons, which I think you have to do, you also have to be aware of the limits that humans face. And in particular, because it's difficult to forecast how technology is going to develop, what we can say, and I talk a lot about this in the article, it is almost impossible to debias humans. It is almost impossible to debias them, particularly in combat. Both the US Army and the Canadian armies have had these massive meta studies of the cognitive and social psychology of soldiering. And what they ultimately concluded was the only way to improve the performance of human soldiers in combat is to give them a lot more time to think about what they're doing. And of course, the takeaway from that was, well, you can't say, excuse me, can you give me 30 seconds before you shoot at me? Because I want to make sure that I've thought through all the possibilities and I'm confident that you are a combatant. It doesn't work in combat. The only effective debiasing technique doesn't apply to soldiers in conflict. So I don't think I answered all the aspects of your question, but that is really the emphasis. It's just to remember that we should not overemphasize or put too much faith in human decision making when we're trying to say that machines shouldn't make decisions. Oh, I know what the last thing was. and this is a whole other topic, but I'm a lot more afraid of AI assisted decision making than I am autonomous weapons, precisely because it keeps the human in the loop, and which of course everybody in this field seems to want to keep the human in the loop. But it's hard enough for the average soldier to deal with all of the demands on their perception and their cognition now. Adding these DSS systems are, at least there's no evidence so far that it's going to improve the ability of human soldiers to comply with IHL. It may. And there are obviously a lot of brilliant people out there trying to work on how you present this knowledge to, the information to the soldier. I mean, I'm not the only person who realizes that humans have cognitive limitations. But I think we also have to have that same discussion in the DSS space. We really have to think, what are you actually gaining by continuing to keep the human in the loop? Is it possible that maybe taking them completely out of it would actually have a positive effect? And I don't know the answer to that because I haven't looked carefully at it, but I think we have to have that discussion as well, and I haven't seen it as much in the literature.
Thank you so much. This was fascinating. I'm a postdoc here, building off of Anna's points, perhaps. Follow me here a little bit. I can't help but when you think about autonomous weapons, think about Waymos in San Francisco, right? And the fact that people tend to really, almost as this preference, I'd rather be accidentally killed by a human than killed by a machine, right? They'd rather that sort of human element be a part of it. So I'm very sympathetic to your argument. But maybe even though this isn't part of the consequentialist aspect, I think it's important to think about, the consequences of the argument itself, and thinking through the fact that maybe you're making too artificial of a distinction between humans and machines. To what degree? I mean, we know that in cases of like Waymos in these cars, they're more likely, at least at one point in time, to hit Black or brown people. And that's built into the algorithm because human biases are built into the algorithms of these machines. I'm not saying that might not get better, but how do you address that sort of fact that humanity still is inflecting the machines themselves, right? So I guess that's my main question, and then follows up, how do you see this mattering in terms of policing? I study police in post-conflict situations, and that these weapons or these autonomous systems start to become a veneer of objectivity that allows for the state to essentially do whatever it wants to do and claim that it was objectively done.
Yeah. Your last question is a really tough one. Let me just say maybe one comment about Waymo before getting to your question, which is, but I think it's really important because every time one of their autonomous taxis kills someone, it is front page news all over the world. But then if you actually look at the statistics of how many people are killed per mile by autonomous taxis versus human drivers, there's no comparison. Waymo is unbelievably more safe. And part of this goes to the humans are really bad at dealing with statistical information. They deal much more with narrative and, I'm losing the word, actual examples than anecdotes. That was the word I was looking for.
And humans are bad drivers.
And humans are bad drivers, But so if you
everybody else on the road is a bad driver. I'm great.
Exactly.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you. I was checking my phone.
But so you have to have that comparison to really understand that that there's actually a case to be made for the autonomous taxis. And I've never taken one. I really want to take one. I see them zooming around Palo Alto. So 2 points. Both of what you said is incredibly important. For one thing, I am also kind of doing ideal types. It's either a human soldier or it's an autonomous weapon. And of course, in actual conflict situations, for the foreseeable future, it will almost always be human-machine teaming in some way. And that's a whole nother set of issues where, again, we have to think through how human cognitive biases are going to be affected or positively or negatively in that kind of teaming situation. I also haven't done that much thinking about it. But the really important thing that I think you said, not that the other things were unimportant, but any autonomous weapon, of course, is only as good as its programming. It's only as good as the data that is being used to train on it. And that programming and that data will be, to some extent, curated by humans. And in this regard, I absolutely recommend it if you haven't seen it. My colleague Lena Trabucco at the University of Copenhagen, she has a 3-part series on meaningful human control, just came out in International Legal Studies, where she starts with programmers and goes to all the different levels of commanders and how humans are involved in this process. So you never eliminate the human. You never eliminate the potential for all of those biases. As you absolutely said, I mean, I'm horrified and scared of the possibility that if we ever do allow autonomous weapons to lethally target humans, that all of the kinds of corrupted data or the biased data that leads to racially problematic policing will just be reproduced in a much more dangerous environment. Nobody should ever minimize that problem if they're on the pro-autonomous weapons side. But what I will say is it's not that humans are taken out of the process with autonomous weapons, but it's moved back temporally. The human involvement is at a time when you actually do have the time to try to overcome the heuristics, the biases. You're not trying to make the decision about what the autonomous weapon should attack while you're in the middle of combat. You're actually, in the safety of your own headquarters, deciding, well, what is the target profile that we're going to allow this autonomous weapon to pursue? How are we going to ring fence it? What is the geographic space in which we're going to allow it to loiter for however long? Not that you're never going to make a mistake in that situation, because the biases are still there, but you were at least in a colder situation where the kinds of debiasing techniques that humans have shown to be effective might work. So I do think there's something to pushing the human out of that incredibly high stress, dangerous, uncertain environment. Doesn't solve all the problems, but I think it helps. But it is also very important to understand that there is always a human involved in the autonomous weapon. It really is just when it's involved. So thank you.
Okay. I'm going to go to Herb, and then you're next in the queue. Yes, Herb.
Thank you. Thank you. That was a great talk. I was wondering if you could entertain another hypothesis as to why these folks are opposed to.
I can hear you, but I don't think you're.
Which is the sense that you get from a lot of people that robots are much more easily. We can see robots going crazy more easily. And the fear is not that they're going to be great at, it's not that they won't be able to make these fine distinctions, but they'll just start killing indiscriminately. And the idea that there's just going to be killer robots, a la Skynet, that's going to just go around crazy, be going crazy and killing people, and that's what they want to stop. It's an unarticulated fear. They don't talk about it like that, but I wonder whether or not there's something to that. Please comment.
I mean, I think about the Slaughterbots movies. Right. I just find them to be shamelessly propagandistic. Obviously, the potential for errors to be made from an autonomous weapon in a complex system like that, there is going to be an error rate. And there is a danger when you have an error from an autonomous weapon. The potential for catastrophic human casualties is there. I mean, these are going to be very dangerous weapons. And again, nobody should ever minimize that. But I would still say, how different is that than humans? Soldiers also go crazy in combat and murder everybody. I mean, My Lai is a really, really good example of how human soldiers can have a groupthink that leads to just catastrophic consequences. Every weapon system has an error rate. No weapon is accurate 100% of the time. But what I think is really important about your comment is one of the things that you see often argued against autonomous weapons is the transparency, is the black box problem. That if something goes wrong, you can't necessarily figure out why the AI made the decisions that it made. And again, I don't know enough about the technology you know a lot more than I do about this. But what I can say is the idea that humans can reliably narrate why they made decisions is also greatly overstated. We all think we can. My mentor when I was a grad student in literature at Duke University a long time ago was Stanley Fish. And Stanley Fish has this absolutely brilliant article entitled Dennis Martinez and the Uses of Theory. And Dennis Martinez was famous for throwing one of the greatest curveballs in the history of baseball. And a reporter asked him one day, Dennis, how do you throw such an incredible curveball? And Martinez answered, he said, well, I could give you, I could narrate the process. Where I put my fingers, how my elbow is arranged, how I put the spin on the ball. But it is anything but clear that our own narration of how we reach a decision accurately reflects how we did make the decision. So that isn't to like exculpate autonomous weapons for not being transparent. But again, when a soldier goes off reservation and kills a bunch of prisoners of war or a bunch of civilians, and you're trying to investigate and decide whether to prosecute them, you can ask them why they did what they did, but there's no guarantee that they're even going to tell you the truth, much less, even if they try to tell you the truth, that the truth is actually going to correspond to what they actually were thinking. We can't know that. Humans are black boxes in a way that is not fundamentally dissimilar from autonomous weapons. And my technology friends say that there are ways over time that we will be able to understand how AI systems made the decisions they made. But we're never going to eliminate errors. We're never going to eliminate catastrophic outcomes. But we have not managed to do that with human soldiers either. So again, I think you have to have a comparison between what humans are capable of and machines are capable of. And even that's controversial. There are people who say that you shouldn't be comparing humans and machines. You should hold machines to a much higher standard. I think I'm a little too consequentialist for that. And I think you have to have a more pragmatic approach to, we want to make war more humane. What's going to get the job done in that particular situation?
The mere mention of baseball provoked a two-finger from Scott.
Baseball was the repeated mentioning of My Lai. I think you're making a strong argument about how common it is for revenge and hatred and racism and other human things, human emotions, to cause soldiers to go berserk. But My Lai also is known because Hugh Thompson was humane and stopped it. What would be the killer? I guess it's the killer angel. Yeah. What would be the killer angel who would, in an autonomous world, be able to stop something that, even if it might be legal because they're doing something in a more IHL non-violation, but was wrong? Is there anything in that space that makes you think that there will be killer angels like Hugh Thompson?
It's a really good point. And Hugh, since I've been writing about the Vietnam War now for quite a while, he is truly one of my heroes. I mean, he is the man, in case you don't know, who literally landed his helicopter between Medina and I'm blanking on Cali. He landed between the civilians who were being killed and his fellow soldiers, and ordered his own soldiers that if they don't stop, open fire, kill Cali, Medina, all of the other American soldiers who were involved in the massacre. And truly, I mean, how many more people would have died if he didn't do that? It's a really interesting question. I haven't thought that much about it. I guess I have a certain sympathy. I don't tend to agree with him on most things, but Ronald Arkin is kind of like the high priest of ethical roboting. And I'm very skeptical that you can actually program ethics into a robot. But I do think he makes some good points in that if you embedded an autonomous weapon with human soldiers in every combat situation, there's also the autonomous weapon is not going to fail to turn over a report of an IHL violation because it feels sympathy for its colleagues who they've been playing poker with the night before. it may well be that one role that autonomous weapons can play, or autonomous, doesn't even have to be a weapon. I mean, autonomous machines can play, is keeping track of what humans are doing in a way that humans themselves are very likely not to do. So whether they'll actually stop a massacre, I don't know. I would like to think so. But I do think there are some benefits from taking out of altering the group dynamics that are so strong in the context of combat.
Okay, Herb had a very quick two-finger on this. Our question per minute rate is not going to get us to the end of the queue, so let's try and keep the question brief and the answers brief too.
The response to Scott is it's possible to have an independent monitor that is not part of the AI system that looks for catastrophic outcomes. And you have to be able to recognize the catastrophic outcome. It has to be independent so it can actually forcibly stop the AI from doing the bad thing. Okay? More on that later.
Okay, so I'm going to take two at the back corner and back middle, and two in a row, and then you can answer them together. Okay. So you're first, yes.
I'm back corner. Okay. I'm Elizabeth Petté-Cornell, professor of engineering, and I have a question.
I'm in trouble. I can already tell.
I have a question for you. Does the argument that you make apply to the highest levels of command on the field, top commanders on the field who are in charge of autonomous, having their hands autonomous drones? And they have two options. One is to use them in the autonomous mode against an adversary that does the same and to go fast. And that's, but the other option is to delay the response using conventional weapons to keep time, for example, for truce, to discuss a truce. And this example is one that I got from someone who has faced that situation. What do you think?
And we'll take the other question from the back, and then you can answer them.
Thank you for the very good presentation. My name is Sitara Noor, and I'm a postdoctoral fellow at CSAC. My question comes from your last slide where you talk about a tragedy is between two good, a conflict between two good. And I think when we talk about autonomous weapons, the discussion actually is based on three levels. One is discussion, a conflict between two goods, where the argument goes that the autonomous weapon actually are more compliant to the IHL. And on the opposite side, there are various companies who have sided with the killer robot, the banning killer robot campaign, which say that investment in autonomous weapon actually hinders the development otherwise as well, so they should be stopped. The second conflict is between two bads in which both sides are saying that while autonomous weapon kills many people indiscriminately, can kill people indiscriminately, so do the humans. And the third conflict, I think, the debate where it takes place is a conflict between a good and a bad. And this is where I'm talking about automation in nuclear command and control systems, because so far humans have actually been turned out to be the good, because it was a human factor which perhaps has saved the world from a nuclear catastrophe so far. And thinking a machine in control in various of episodes that has happened during the Cold War, perhaps result would have been different. And so this is a conflict between a good and a bad. So what's your take on automation in nuclear command and control system, considering how that takes
Maybe
place?
I'll start with that one. You should answer it because you got it in your title. So, I definitely don't want to have anyone in the room take away from my talk that I don't think that there's ever a place for humans or a need for humans in conflict situations. As I said with the DPHing example, there are definitely times when a machine is not going to make as accurate a decision as a human. We do read other people's emotions imperfectly, but we're capable of it. So, you know, I'm not a nuclear expert, but it certainly strikes me as an area in which you perhaps don't want just a human, but you also definitely don't just want a machine. I mean, it's easy to point at like the famous example of, you know, the Russian colonel who essentially averted World War III by refusing to launch the warheads because of some, I can't remember exactly what went wrong, but it was clearly the fact that it was a human there who was thinking and not just carrying out his orders that perhaps saved the whole world. But we also can't kind of cherry pick those examples And this is why I think it's really important to talk about the role of positive emotions. I would never deny that there are good situations in which a soldier who has the legal right to pull the trigger doesn't. I mean, I think the Sergeant Chester example is an important one, but of course, emotions can actually be positive on the battlefield. But we can't just look at that. We also have to look at all the situations in which the human leads to the bad outcome. And we have to just decide, when do we think that it's so important to keep the human, and when do we think that perhaps eliminating the human on balance is the better option? I'm pretty sure that in the nuclear context, that's not one that you want to completely automate, because of course, an error in that situation, I mean, obviously, a killer robot that commits a my-lai, that's a terrible thing, but a killer robot that messes up nuclear deterrence could be millions and millions of casualties. So, I think the kind of the precautionary principle says we don't want to completely automate that. I'm not sure I quite get your question.
Okay, so let me try to be clear. So imagine that now we are no longer talking about a soldier, but a commander on a field, top commander. And that top commander has the possibility of using missiles or using conventional weapons. And the problem there are two options. Using missiles to go faster, particularly if you're up against people who do use these autonomous missiles, or deciding to use conventional weapons in order to keep some time, for example, for a truce. So how would you how would you argue a case like this? What is it that you would tell these people?
Well, so I think one of the interesting aspects of this question is the legal one. That if you are a military that has autonomous weapons, and of course not all militaries are ever going to have them, but if you're, say, the United States, which for all of its problems does have a very well-trained professional military, if you're a commander and you have a choice between soldiers and autonomous weapons, there may be a legal obligation to use the autonomous weapon if you feel that it is going to result in fewer civilian casualties. It's the principle of precautions. You might actually have to do that. There's a very robust debate in IHL about to what extent can a commander essentially count force protection more than the protection of combatants or civilians on the other side. And you get different answers to this. That will also factor in here. There will be a tendency, I think a dangerous tendency, for commanders who have access to autonomous weapons to overuse them because, frankly, the consequences of your career for killing a few civilians are probably not as severe as killing more of your own soldiers. So if you can protect your soldiers by using an autonomous weapon, even in a situation in which it's probably not advisable, I think there's going to be a very human tendency to do that. With the last part of your question, there's a whole, again, I'm focusing on the most difficult examples, the actual use of lethal force against humans by machines. There's a whole other set of things that happen in combat, short of that, where I think autonomous weapons can be really, really useful. And I think there's less controversy about that. Like, it's kind of cool that, that we've thought of ways that an autonomous weapon could actually take surrender. Like, not necessarily physically, but the Ukrainians do it more with drones, but they actually lead the enemy soldiers to the safe space where they can surrender. Autonomous weapons will offer a lot of advantages in a whole range of military activities short of lethal force. And last thing, because I know I'm being wordy, but one of the reasons I try to focus on Ukraine in this talk is when we think about autonomous weapons, we kind of naturally go to the bad guys using them, the ones that we don't think are going to use them responsibly, the militaries that are aggressors. But there is something really profound, I think, about thinking about autonomous weapons in the context of Ukraine, where you have probably the most sympathetic, military imaginable. Should we make them lose more soldiers because we have, say, deontological objections to people being killed by machines? if you believe that, and I respect people who believe that, even if I disagree with them, what you are saying to Ukraine is, I'm sorry, we think killer robots are so inherently bad that you have to lose more soldiers. Even though you have the technology and even though you've been using it to all reported accounts responsibly, they're bad. And you need to let more soldiers die. Again, I don't want to, I think you can have a reasonable disagreement about that. But I think that's the question that particularly the deontological thinkers have to grapple with. They have to not think about it just in the context of the bad situations. They have to think about it in the more sympathetic, for lack of a better term, situations. I'm not imputing these ideas to you. I'm just saying, but you're the ethicist. So, yeah.
Okay, we have two fingers on this, but we also have 6 people on the queue, and we have less than 15 minutes. So
we can chat at the
I'm gonna
if we don't get to it all.
I'm gonna ask for these two fingers to be extremely tightly framed and for very short answers, and then we'll go back to the queue. So you're first, yeah.
I'm Elizabeth Good. I'm a postdoc at CSEC as well. So your argument seems bound by autonomous weapons can follow international humanitarian law better, and therefore that makes them more humane. And you kind of just pointed in your answer how IHL isn't clean cut, right? As well as, humans violate IHL all the time. I'm wondering, to what extent does this set up a race to the bottom in that, IHL just kind of implodes as a result or gets down to its most, thinly bare approach to it?
And we'll take the 2-finger hit.
My concern is, could the use of autonomous weapons actually prolong wars? I'm a physician. I don't like seeing people die. And now you're saying, well, we can use autonomous weapons. We can save our soldiers' lives. We can spare some civilians. We can continue this war. It's 3 years now.
Yeah.
My concern.
Yeah, and I think it's a very valid one. I think that really is the essence of the ad bellum objection, that the clean war is still war in which an awful lot of people die lawfully, and we definitely don't want to promote that. And it may very well be that the force protection and the increased precision of targeting creates incentives to continue wars when they shouldn't be continued. One does have to balance against that, like, well, the Noel Sharkey argument, it makes me a little nervous when, it kind of implies that we should have really, really, really horrible wars because they'll end more quickly. And again, Sam Moyn has written a lot about this, but it goes back, that idea that war should be terrible because then we'll end it more quickly, goes back centuries. I'm not sure whether it's accurate, but it is definitely something to consider. And then in some ways, your question, so this guy, among others, but I think this guy's the best, has really helped us rethink the nature of the crime of aggression and the unlawful use of force. For so long, we focused on Nuremberg. It was the problem with aggression is it doesn't stop with invading a country. It then leads to war crimes and crimes against humanity and genocide, the evil of the whole contained within the act of aggression, the kind of paraphrase the Nuremberg judgment. What scholars like Tom have pointed out, and I think really fundamentally changed how we think about this, that it's not just the unlawful violence that is the problem. It's the lawful violence that follows from the act of aggression. You can lawfully kill a Ukrainian soldier if you are a Russian soldier. It doesn't matter this is the clearest cut example of aggression in the past 30 or 40 years. That's completely lawful. In addition, you can kill an awful lot of civilians completely lawfully because the principle of proportionality allows it. So it's not just the unlawful violence caused by aggression, it's also the lawful violence that is the problem. And so I use that as a way of kind of backdooring into your point, which is there is that danger, right? That if we're just hyper-focused on compliance with the most basic rules of IHL, that we really will obscure the fact that war that is fought completely humanely still involves an incredible amount of human suffering. And so again, that's kind of why I try to focus on the jus ad bellum argument, because I'm just a lot more convinced by the ad bellum side than the in bello side. I think if you really want to focus on the problems with autonomous weapons, it is that lowering of the barriers to entry into conflict. Not so much that they're going to go crazy and massacre civilians all the time, because I think we'll get past that stage with the technology at some point. We will never get past the stage of IHL allowing just as much lawful violence as it prohibits. So I don't think I completely answered your question, but
Chat.
Okay, I'm going to go to Rose, Alan, Jim, and then I have 3 here, which maybe it's going to be in the conversation afterwards, but you are recognized.
You can take me off the list. Satara
Okay.
asked my question.
Okay, great. So let's go to Alan and then you're next.
Great talk. Looking forward to the paper. This is not I'm sympathetic to your argument about the use ad bellum, but I think there's a similar use in bello argument. And it's actually not a use in bello, it's just an in bello. And maybe this is a little bit of a riff on Elizabeth's question, but there is evidence from some of the scholarship that I've seen suggesting that because they move so quickly, they decide so quickly, autonomous weapons are likely to pull the trigger when humans might reflect, and that they have a tendency to be escalatory. So this, in ways that could perhaps be perfectly IHL compliant, but it's not a use ad bellum question in the sense that we're more likely to go to war because we can fight in this way, but the wars are going to be worse. The violence is going to be swifter, more intense, more violent. Is that another argument against autonomous weapons?
Then we'll go to Jim before you answer.
Great, thank you. Thanks for the talk. Most important thing I learned is that there's an academic article on Dennis Martinez. I had no idea. Pitched for the Orioles when I was in high school, and because my dad was a doctor for the team, I spent my high school years lugging ice for the trainer for the pitchers to soak their arms in. So cool. I spent a lot of time with the pitchers, and I'm looking forward to reading the article. Okay. So I'm interested in this issue of cognitive bias. I also trained in my career on a lot of that literature, and I had a question that was similar to Maya's, but I was interested in your answer because it seemed at odds with what you said in the talk. The way you presented in the talk was humans subject to all this bias. Robots aren't subject to all that bias. But in your answer to Maya, you did seem to acknowledge that it may be a different kind of bias. But I mean, that's what I'm most interested in right now. What are the different biases that we may find with AI that are different from human biases? And then with respect to dismissing the idea of AI-assisted human decision-making, because humans are so limited by their cognitive biases, distorted in their decision-making, why wouldn't we want AI to assist with that? The person I know who's been doing work on this is Phil Tetlock, and he's done a lot of work on forecasting, which is very different from what you're talking about. But as he's looked at AI versus human decision makers, he's found that AI-assisted human forecasters are better than either humans on their own or AI on their own. So I was just wondering why you dismissed it.
Yeah, I hope I didn't dismiss it. Forecasting is a really good example, though, of a cold situation where you do have time to engage in deliberative thought and not just the kind of immediate decision making that is associated with the high stress, the dangerous, uncertain situations like combat. So I didn't mean to have a conflict between those two. It's more the aspect of machines, of course, is, they don't have self-preservation, they don't get tired, they don't get stressed. I mean, they're impervious to a lot of the biases that human soldiers have in the particular context of combat. And some very important biases that humans have that no one has seemed to found a way to get out of in combat. Again, the only solution is to slow it all down, but combat doesn't really wait for people to do that. So I think the more accurate way to present this, and if I had more time, I hope I would have done that, is it's a mapping of the biases and how they affect it. Like, what are the biases that are easily incorporated into an autonomous weapon when you are training them on data versus the biases that a human will express in the moment of conflict when I either shoot or this person might kill me. So it isn't that they're not subject to biases, they're just subject to different types of biases because of the way that they are trained. So we need to map that very carefully. So I didn't mean to imply that that aspect of it doesn't affect the performance of autonomous weapons, because of course it does. Your objection, I mean, it's kind of the positive emotion one, right? I mean, it's, do we want to leave a space open on the battlefield for mercy and compassion? And of course, sometimes the answer will be yes, but sometimes the answer will be no. It's a terrible response, of course. But I still think that we have to balance and not be seduced by anecdote the ability to not pull the trigger versus the ability to pull the trigger only when the trigger should be pulled because you are actually confident that the target is a legitimate target. And as combat gets faster, and it doesn't seem to be any way to slow combat down, I think that on balance, the machines are going to win out in that comparison. Combat is just getting faster and faster. It's tempting to say that we should always have a human on the loop, but having a human on the loop, having to make a final decision about the use of lethal force, peer-on-peer conflict, that could simply not be fast enough to preserve your forces. And again, we do have to think about all the situations in which it's asymmetrical, where powerful militaries will have these weapons and less powerful ones will not. We also have to think about the situations in which you have two powerful militaries, each with them, and that arms race itself. And that arms race I find scary as well, because there's a faster, more and more deadly. So it's not really an answer to your question, but it's to me, I try never to disregard or to not be aware of objections. It's more about contextualizing them and comparing them in a really kind of cold, hard, pragmatic way.
Hey, Rose had a quick two-finger.
Very quickly, thank you. Fascinating discussion. You made the comment that these machines don't tend to self-preservation or don't have that same, but the research is showing now that as new AI systems are being developed, the older versions are tending toward self-preservation. So that's a big concern with regard, again, to the nuclear question. Absolutely. Will they tend toward self-preservation by essentially killing us off with nuclear weapons? I mean, this is kind of science fiction, but nevertheless, it's clear from research that they do tend toward self-preservation.
Yeah, I mean, that's scary. I mean, I hope that the people who know more about this stuff than I do can figure out ways to make sure that an autonomous weapon doesn't decide that its life is more important than all the civilians, in the area. But there's no guarantee. Yeah, I think it's an incredibly important point. Awful lot we don't know about how AI is going to function, and it is scary when you're talking about lethal situations, those errors.
And Colin wanted to jump in quickly.
Well, just as maybe a closing point. So thank you. It's a fascinating conversation. I think one of the things that gives people pause about killer robots is, I mean, we can debate whether humans or machines are more likely to make mistakes. But there's a sense that when humans make mistakes, there's moral accountability for it. And I think part of this is who's accountable when machines are highly autonomous. Humans aren't in the loop or on the loop, they're out of the loop. Then where's the moral, like where does moral accountability fall? And how should we think, how should we think about that? I think that's what gives a lot of people separate from some of the arguments that you.
And legal accountability.
Well, I was going to, so a very common argument is the command responsibility argument, that there's no accountability for autonomous weapons. And I don't have time to address that, but I actually think that objection is just doctrinally wrong. And in my article, I have a huge section trying to explain how, when soldiers make honest mistakes, they are also not criminally liable. And thus, if they are not criminally liable, their commanders are not criminally liable. I don't think accountability gaps exist that are greater for autonomous weapons than the accountability gaps that exist for human soldiers. So if you're interested doctrinally, there's that. The moral question, though, is a really difficult one. I could cheat and I could go back to these questions and say that, well, you aren't taking the human out of the loop broadly conceived. Somebody had to have designed that autonomous weapon. Someone had to program it. The tactical commander had to actually turn it on and send it off. Is the moral responsibility fundamentally less for that tactical commander than the bombardier who drops things from 35,000 feet on people that he can't see? Is it fundamentally different than the drone operator who is just seeing the victims through? Probably there will. I'm sure there are differences, but I'm not convinced that we're somehow. I'm not suggesting you're saying this, that we're in some kind of morality-free, area with autonomous weapons. I don't believe that. If we ever get to that next stage where autonomous weapons are not just executing complicated programming, but are actually deciding, that the recursive machine learning leads them to be able to generate new targets. I was programmed, anthropomorphizing, I was programmed to attack tanks, but I think I'm also going to attack, these vehicles because I've decided that they are just as dangerous as tanks. Then I think we are in a moral and legal accountability vacuum that is really troubling. But I don't think we're anywhere near that kind of discussion yet. Really, there is still a human being putting in parameters into an autonomous weapon. How long can it loiter? How much geography can it cover? What are not just the target, but the class of targets that it can go after? So I think there should still be moral accountability for that. I would like to think that a tactical commander suffers if the autonomous weapon ends up malfunctioning.
This will shift the moral accountability into the design of the weapon more than the behavior of the weapon, because the faster that the speed of war and innovation happens, the more pressure there will be to deploy systems before they're fully tested and evaluated. And we also know these systems demonstrate emerging capabilities and properties that the designers actually don't fully understand and aren't completely explicable. And so if we don't apply accountability to that, to not the specific act, but the decision to deploy a system that you were not confident would be compliant with IHL, then I think we're on a slippery slope.
I agree, and I think I'm much more convinced by the moral accountability arguments than the legal accountability arguments. And again, in my article, I talk a lot about the many hands objection. I try to show that it's actually really not a very compelling objection from a legal perspective, but it may well be much more compelling the kind of the distribution of responsibility for how an autonomous weapon operates. It may reduce that sense of moral accountability. Does the Raytheon engineer feel suffer morally for a tragedy or atrocity committed by a malfunctioning weapon in the same way that the person who launches the Patriot missile does? Probably not. So I do think there are a lot of issues that we have to think through at the moral level there. But I think that's a better moral argument than, there's something, a lot of these arguments from dignity that it's better to be flamethrowered by a human soldier than shot by an autonomous weapon. I mean, those are the deontological objections that I find really problematic. Yours is a much, much better one.
Okay, with sincere apologies to those of you on the queue.
And I will promise you that I will answer any questions you have when we're...
Please join me in thanking Kevin John Heller.